He walked into her life like a dream, rich, charming, protective. She introduced him to her daughter, trusted him, loved him. But what she didn't know was that it all started with a bet, a $2 million bet to make her fall in love. Blake. Carter was a man who had everything, or at least that was what the world believed. At 35, he was the CEO of Carter Tech, one of the most powerful technology firms in the country. A man who had built an empire from nothing but his intelligence, ambition, and an unwavering hunger to win. His name was synonymous with success, his face gracing business magazines, his wealth ranking among the most elite. He lived in a penthouse overlooking Manhattan, drove cars most people could only dream of, and spent his evenings in the company of women who knew exactly who he was and what he could offer them. Yet, despite the endless luxury, the carefully curated image of power and control, there was an emptiness beneath it all, a quiet void he never acknowledged. To Blake, life was a game, and he played it better than anyone else. He had spent years mastering the art of control, controlling his company, controlling the market, controlling people. There was nothing he couldn't have, no deal he couldn't close, no challenge he couldn't overcome. It was this mindset that led him to that fateful evening sitting in the dimly lit VIP section of an upscale bar with his closest friends, sipping whiskey worth more than most people's monthly rent. The conversation had been light at first, business, investments, the latest scandals in their elite social circle, until Nick Calloway, his oldest friend, and the only person who dared to push him, leaned forward with a smirk that spelled trouble. "You've done it all, Carter. Made billions, conquered every industry, had every woman you wanted," Nick said, swirling his drink. "But I bet you can't do this." Blake raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Do what?" Nick's smirk deepened. He gestured toward the restaurant across the street, a small, unimpressive fast food chain, a world away from their usual extravagant haunts. "I bet you can't make someone from that world fall for you. Not just any woman, but someone completely outside our reality. No models, no socialites, someone real." Blake followed his friend's gaze, his eyes landing on a woman behind the counter. She was wiping down tables with quiet efficiency, her brown hair pulled into a simple ponytail, her uniform slightly worn but clean. There was no sign of luxury. In her appearance, no carefully applied makeup, no desperate attempt to impress anyone. She was just living. Rachel Evans. He didn't know her yet, but something about her struck him. Maybe it was the way she moved, precise and methodical, as if every action had purpose. Maybe it was the way she kept her head down, focused, unaffected by the chaos of the restaurant around her. Or maybe it was the exhaustion hidden in her posture, the weight of responsibility pressing on her shoulders. Blake tilted his head. "You want me to seduce a waitress?" Nick laughed. "Not just seduce. Marry her. Make her fall for you. Marry her. Bring her into your world. And keep her there. No contracts. No schemes. A real marriage." Blake chuckled, leaning back in his chair. "And what do I get?" Nick took a slow sip of his drink. $2 million. Blake let out a short laugh, shaking his head. $2 million was pocket change to him. This wasn't about the money. It was about the challenge. About proving once again that he could win at anything. He had never been turned down before. Women fell at his feet with little more than a glance. This would be no different. His lips curled into a smirk. "Done." His friends erupted into laughter, clinking glasses, already entertained by the game about to unfold. But as Blake turned his attention back to the woman behind the counter, something unexpected settled in his chest. An unfamiliar sense of curiosity. He had won many things in life, but Rachel Evans would be different. The next day, he found himself standing in line at the restaurant, a place he would never have stepped foot in otherwise. The air smelled of fried food and spilled soda, the hum of conversation blending with the beeping of the cash register. People in business suits stood next to teenagers, mothers with young children, construction workers on their break. It was a world completely unlike his own, chaotic and real in a way that unsettled him. When it was his turn to order, he met Rachel's eyes for the first time. They were brown, warm but guarded, eyes that had seen struggle and knew better than to trust easily. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice polite but distant. Blake smiled, turning on the charm that had never failed him. "I think so. What would you recommend?" Rachel didn't react the way most women did. She didn't smile back, didn't flirt, didn't give him even the smallest sign of interest. Instead, she blinked at him, unimpressed. "It's a fast food place. Everything's the same." Blake chuckled, intrigued. "Then I'll have whatever your favorite is." Rachel raised an eyebrow but didn't question it. She punched in the order, handed him a receipt, and moved on to the next customer without another glance. Blake wasn't used to being dismissed. It only made him more determined. Over the next week, he returned, always at the same time, always ordering something different, always finding a way to start a conversation. It was clear she thought he was strange, maybe even annoying, but she tolerated him, and that, in itself, was progress. Then, on the 6th day, as she handed him his tray, she sighed. "You're persistent, aren't you?" Blake grinned. "You have no idea." Rachel studied him for a moment before shaking her head. "You don't belong here." The statement was blunt, matter-of-fact. Blake leaned in slightly, his smirk never fading. "Maybe I just like the company." Rachel rolled her eyes, but he caught the faintest trace of amusement in them, and for the first time in a long time, Blake felt something unexpected. He felt like he was playing a game he didn't quite know the rules to, and for a man who had always been in control, that was a dangerous feeling. Blake Carter had never had to chase anyone before. Women came to him effortlessly, drawn by his wealth, his power, his carefully cultivated image of success. But Rachel Evans was different. She wasn't impressed by his name or his tailored suits. She wasn't interested in the charm he had perfected over the years. And that was exactly why he kept coming back. At first, it had been about the bet, a challenge. A game to prove he could win over anyone, even someone from a world so vastly different from his own. But as the days passed, as he found himself returning to that fast food restaurant more often than he cared to admit, something shifted. He started noticing things he normally wouldn't. The way Rachel always tied her hair up in the same messy ponytail, strands escaping to frame her face. The way her hands moved quickly, efficiently, as she wiped down tables, her expression never revealing just how exhausted she probably was. The way she spoke to customers with patience, even when they were rude, her voice steady, controlled. Blake had spent years surrounding himself with people who only told him what he wanted to hear, who only existed in his orbit because of what he could offer them. Rachel was the first person in a long time who didn't care who he was, and that made her more fascinating than any woman he had ever met. One evening, after watching her from his usual corner of the restaurant, he decided it was time to take things further. When she passed by his table to clear the trays, he leaned back slightly, offering her one of his easy smiles. "Rachel, right?" She barely looked at him. "Yeah, what do you need?" He tilted his head, studying her. "You must get off work at some point. How about a coffee?" Rachel blinked at him, clearly caught off guard. Then, to his surprise, she let out a short laugh. It wasn't the kind of laughter he was used to, the flirty, practiced kind. It was genuine, amused, almost incredulous. "You want to have coffee with me?" Blake smirked. "Why not?" She shook her head. "Look, I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but I don't have time for it." His smirk didn't fade. If anything, it grew. "Who said I was playing a game?" Rachel met his gaze, her eyes sharp, searching. Then, just as quickly, she turned away. "I have work to do." Blake watched her go, feeling an unfamiliar sense of frustration. He wasn't used to being dismissed, but instead of discouraging him, it only made him more determined. The next day, he returned, and the day after that. Each time he found a way to engage her, even if it was just for a moment. At first, she remained distant, indifferent, but slowly, little by little, she started responding. The first time she smirked at one of his remarks, he felt something unexpected stir in his chest. The first time she rolled her eyes but didn't immediately walk away, he knew he was making progress. One afternoon, as she was cleaning up a nearby table, he leaned forward slightly. "What would it take for you to say yes to coffee?" Rachel didn't even look up. "A miracle," Blake chuckled. "I'm good at making those happen." She paused, glancing at him. For the first time, there was something in her expression. That wasn't immediate rejection. Curiosity, maybe. Amusement. Then she sighed. "Fine. 1 coffee. But only because I need a break." Blake grinned. "You won't regret it." Rachel arched an eyebrow. "I already do." But she showed up. That evening, at a small cafe down the street, she arrived just as he was checking his watch. She still wore her work uniform, her hair pulled up as always, her expression wary. She sat across from him, arms crossed, watching him carefully. Blake had been on countless dates before, expensive dinners, private rooftop events, exclusive getaways, but sitting across from Rachel in that tiny cafe, with its dim lighting and the scent of coffee lingering in the air, felt different. "So," Rachel said, her voice cutting through the silence, "why are you really here?" Blake took a sip of his coffee, meeting her gaze. "Maybe I just like your company." Rachel exhaled sharply. "Try again." Blake smirked. "All right. Maybe I'm just curious about you." Rachel studied him for a moment before shaking her head. "Guys like you don't go after women like me." His smirk faltered slightly. "And what kind of guy am I?" Rachel leaned back in her chair, tilting her head. "Rich. Powerful. Someone who's used to getting what he wants." Blake chuckled, though there was no humor in it. "That's an interesting assumption." Rachel shrugged. "It's not an assumption if it's true." He exhaled, watching her. "And what about you? What's your story, Rachel?" She hesitated, then gave a small shrug. "Not much to tell. I work. I take care of my daughter. That's it." Blake felt something shift inside him. He hadn't expected that. "You have a daughter?" Rachel nodded, her expression unreadable. "Her name is Chloe. She's 5. Something about the way she said it, steady, unwavering, made Blake realize that Rachel wasn't just a woman trying to make ends meet. She was a mother, a protector, someone who had built her world around something far more important than money or ambition. And for the first time, Blake felt out of his depth. He was used to women who wanted things from him: luxury, status, power. Rachel wanted nothing except to keep her life together. Blake leaned forward slightly. "That must be tough." Rachel's lips pressed into a thin line. "I manage." Blake didn't know why, but he suddenly wanted to know more. About her struggles, about Chloe, about the life she had built on her own. But he also knew that if he pushed too hard, she would shut him out completely. So instead, he simply said, "I admire that." Rachel looked at him then, really looked at him, as if she was seeing something she hadn't expected. Then, after a long pause, she gave a small nod. "Thanks." For the rest of the evening, the conversation shifted. It became easier, lighter, more natural. They talked about meaningless things: bad customers, city traffic, favorite coffee flavors. And as the night went on, Blake realized something that sent an unfamiliar feeling through his chest. He was enjoying himself, not because of the challenge, not because of the bet, but because of her. And that was dangerous, because for the first time since this all started, Blake Carter didn't feel like he was playing a game. He felt like he was falling into something he hadn't planned for. Blake, Carter wasn't supposed to care. That had never been part of the plan. When he had first walked into that Burger King, his only intention had been to win. To prove, once again, that there was no challenge too difficult for him, no person he couldn't charm. But now, as he sat across from Rachel in a dimly lit cafe, he felt something shift, something he wasn't prepared for. She had agreed to coffee, but it was clear she wasn't here for small talk. Her arms were crossed, her expression skeptical, as if waiting for him to reveal his true intentions. She had been wary from the beginning, but tonight she was even more guarded. Blake wasn't used to that. He wasn't used to women who met him with walls instead of open doors. "So what's your endgame here?" Rachel asked, stirring her coffee absent-mindedly. Blake leaned back in his chair, studying her. "Endgame?" Rachel raised an eyebrow. "You're a billionaire. You don't belong in a place like that, and you definitely don't belong in my world. So why keep showing up?" Blake knew he should have said something smooth, something lighthearted. But for some reason he found himself telling the truth, at least part of it. "Maybe I just like talking to you." Rachel scoffed. "Right, because I'm so fascinating." Blake smirked. "You are, actually." That made her pause. For the first time that evening, she looked at him with something other than skepticism. There was curiosity now, a flicker of uncertainty, as if she wasn't sure whether he was playing her or being genuine. She exhaled, shaking her head. "You don't make sense to me." Blake leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the table. "Why not?" Rachel hesitated, then said, "Because people like you don't see people like me." That sentence hit him harder than he expected. He had spent years living in a world where everything was about status, about wealth, about being seen. But Rachel, she had spent her life being invisible. For the first time in a long time, Blake found himself speechless. Rachel took another sip of her coffee, as if giving herself a moment to think. "Let's get one thing straight," she said finally. "I don't do games. I don't have time for them. If you're here for some kind of thrill or whatever, then find someone else." Blake should have walked away. Right then and there, he should have admitted defeat, should have let her keep whatever dignity she needed to hold on to. But he didn't. Instead, he did the opposite. He leaned in closer and said, "I'm not walking away that easily." Rachel exhaled sharply, looking away. "You're relentless, aren't you?" Blake smiled. "You have no idea." Rachel shook her head. But for the first time since they met, there was something in her expression that wasn't resistance. It wasn't surrender either, but it was something. Blake knew he had taken the first step, and that was enough. The days that followed were filled with an unspoken tension. Blake continued showing up, sometimes ordering food, sometimes just sitting at a table in the corner, watching as Rachel moved through her shift. He learned small things about her just by observing. The way she always tied her apron a little too tight. The way she pressed her lips together when she was frustrated but didn't want to show it. The way she always wiped the counter down twice, even when it was already clean. He also learned that she wasn't as unaffected by him as she pretended to be. He caught her watching him once, just for a second, before she quickly looked away. He noticed how her posture changed slightly whenever he spoke, like she was trying to remind herself not to get comfortable. She was fighting something, and Blake was determined to find out what. One afternoon, as she was wiping down the tables, Blake finally decided to push a little further. "So tell me about your daughter." Rachel stiffened, her hand pausing for just a fraction of a second before she continued cleaning. "Why?" Blake shrugged. "You talk about her like she's your whole world. I want to know more." Rachel glanced at him, her expression unreadable. Then, after a long pause, she said, "Her name is Chloe. She's 5. She loves dinosaurs and hates bedtime." Blake smiled. "She sounds perfect." Rachel hesitated, then gave a small nod. "She is." Blake wanted to ask more. He wanted to know about Chloe's favorite color, what made her laugh, what her biggest dream was. But he knew that pushing too hard would only make Rachel retreat again. So instead, he simply said, "I'd love to meet her someday." Rachel exhaled, shaking her head. "That's not happening," Blake chuckled. "Not even a little?" "Not even at all," Rachel said firmly. Blake smirked. "We'll see." Rachel rolled her eyes, but this time there was something else in them. Something lighter. Blake had always been good at reading people, and right now, he knew he had just gained a little more ground. He wasn't winning yet, but he was getting closer. That evening, as he left the restaurant and stepped into his car, he pulled out his phone and texted Nick. "This is going to take longer than I thought." A few seconds later, Nick replied, "Doubt it. She'll fall like the rest." Blake stared at the message for a long moment before locking his phone and tossing it onto the seat beside him. Nick was wrong. Rachel wasn't like the rest, and that scared him more than he was willing to admit. Blake Carter had always thought of love as a game, a carefully calculated equation with predictable outcomes. But Rachel Evans was neither predictable nor calculable. She was fire wrapped in quiet resilience, a woman who had learned how to survive in a world that had never given her anything for free. And despite everything he had told himself at the beginning, despite the bet, despite his own arrogance, Blake was starting to realize that he was in deeper than he had ever planned to be. It had started simply enough, small conversations, stolen glances, moments of curiosity that had turned into something more. But now, as he sat across from her in the same cafe where they had first shared coffee, he felt something shifting between them, something that neither of them had the courage to name. Rachel was more at ease than she had been before, but there was still a guardedness in her eyes, a reluctance to believe that someone like him could be anything other than temporary. Blake wanted to change that. He wanted her to trust him, not because of the bet, not because he needed to win, but because somewhere along the way, she had become someone he didn't want to lose. Rachel stirred her coffee absent-mindedly, her gaze flickering toward the window, as if she was trying to convince herself that this was normal, that a man like him sitting across from her meant nothing. Blake studied her, the way her fingers curled around the cup, the way her lips pressed. Together in thought, she had no idea how captivating she was, how effortlessly she had tangled herself into his mind. He wanted to tell her. He wanted to reach across the table, take her hand, and tell her that he was done pretending. But instead he asked, "Are you always this hesitant with people?" Rachel's eyes snapped back to his, surprised. "Excuse me?" Blake leaned forward slightly, his voice calm but direct. "You don't trust easily. I can see it. Every time I get too close, you put up a wall," Rachel exhaled, shaking her head. "That's rich coming from you," Blake smirked. "You're avoiding the question." Rachel sighed, setting her cup down. "Fine. You want the truth? People don't stay. They make promises, and then they leave. I've learned not to expect anything else." Blake felt something tighten in his chest. He had expected some level of distrust, but hearing it so plainly, so openly, made it feel heavier. He had never had to fight for someone's trust before. It was always given to him freely, sometimes too easily. But Rachel was different. She was giving him nothing, and yet he found himself wanting to earn it. "I'm not going anywhere," Blake said quietly. Rachel let out a soft, bitter laugh. "You say that now." Blake didn't look away. "And I'll say it again tomorrow. And the day after that." Rachel stared at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then, slowly, she shook her head. "I don't know what to do with you." Blake smiled, but there was something sincere in his gaze. "Let me figure that out for you." For the first time, Rachel didn't argue. The following week, Blake found himself thinking about Rachel more than he cared to admit. She had gotten under his skin in a way that unsettled him, in a way that made him question things he had never questioned before. He had spent his life chasing power, building his empire, proving that he could have anything he wanted. But Rachel wasn't something to be won. She was a choice, and for the first time in his life, Blake wanted to be chosen back. One evening, he made a decision. He would take things further. If he was going to break through her walls, he needed to show her that he was serious. So he waited outside the restaurant for her shift to end, leaning casually against his car, hands in his pockets. When Rachel finally stepped out, exhaustion written in every line of her body, she froze when she saw him. "What are you doing here?" she asked, adjusting the strap of her bag. Blake pushed off the car, walking toward her. "I figured you might need a ride home." Rachel narrowed her eyes. "Why?" Blake shrugged. "Because I want to." Rachel hesitated, glancing around as if searching for a reason to say no. But then, after a long moment, she sighed. "Fine, but don't make a habit of this." Blake grinned. No promises. As they drove through the city, silence settled. Between them, comfortable but heavy. Blake could feel the weight of her thoughts, the unspoken questions lingering in the air. He wanted to ask what she was thinking, but he knew Rachel wasn't the kind of woman who opened up easily. Instead, he said, "Tell me about Chloe." Rachel blinked, surprised. "What about her?" Blake glanced at her briefly before returning his eyes to the road. "Anything, everything. I want to know more." Rachel was quiet for a moment before she sighed, a small smile tugging at her lips. "She's stubborn, too smart for her own good. She likes dinosaurs and drawing on the walls even though I tell her not to." Blake chuckled. "Sounds like a handful." Rachel nodded, but there was warmth in her expression. "She is, but she's the best thing in my life." Blake could hear the love in her voice, the fierce protectiveness of a mother who had built her world around her child. And in that moment, he realized something. Rachel wasn't just cautious because of her past. She was cautious because she had someone else to think about, and that made him respect her even more. When they finally reached her apartment, Rachel hesitated before getting out of the car. She looked at him, searching for something in his expression. "Why? Are you really doing this?" she asked. Blake exhaled, resting his arm against the steering wheel. "Because I want to." Rachel bit her lip, studying him. Then, after a long pause, she nodded. "Good night, Blake." Blake watched her walk inside, a small smile playing at the corner of his lips. He had expected her to be a challenge. He hadn't expected to care this much. Blake Carter had spent his entire life making decisions based on logic, ambition, and control. Everything he had ever done had been calculated, measured, designed for a specific outcome. But Rachel Evans wasn't something he had planned for. She wasn't a strategic move, a business acquisition, or a deal to be won. And that terrified him. He told himself that he was still in control, that everything was going according to plan. But if that were true, why did he find himself thinking about her at the most unexpected moments? Why did he catch himself replaying their conversations? The way she would challenge him, push back when no one else dared to. Why did he feel something so unfamiliar every time he saw her smile, like a quiet warmth settling into the spaces he had never realized were empty? Rachel had started as a bet, a game, a way to prove that he could win any challenge placed before him. But now, as he found himself waiting outside her apartment once again, he wasn't sure what he was doing anymore. He had never had to chase someone before. And yet here he was, waiting for a woman who didn't need him, didn't want anything from him, didn't even trust him. It should have been frustrating. It should have been a reason to walk away. Instead, it only made him want her more. Rachel emerged from the apartment building, her hair pulled up in a loose ponytail, the exhaustion of a long day written in her posture. She spotted him immediately, pausing for just a second before letting out a sigh. "You again," she muttered, shaking her head. Blake smirked. "Me again?" Rachel crossed her arms. "Are you just going to keep showing up like this?" Blake tilted his head, considering. Probably, Rachel exhaled, rolling her eyes, but he could see the smallest flicker of amusement in them. You're persistent. I'll give you that. Blake leaned against his car, watching her carefully. I told you I don't walk away easily. Rachel studied him for a long moment, then shook her head. I don't get you, Blake. He smiled. Maybe. That's the point. For a brief second, she looked like she might smile back, but then she turned away, walking toward the subway entrance. Blake hesitated for only a moment before falling into step beside her. Rachel shot him a look. Are you following me now? Blake grinned. Just making sure you get home safe, Rachel scoffed. I've been getting home just fine on my own for years, Blake shrugged. Maybe I just like the company. Rachel sighed but didn't argue. They walked in silence for a few blocks, the sounds of the city filling the spaces between them. It was a quiet night, the streets still buzzing with life but not as chaotic as they usually were. For once, Blake wasn't thinking about work, about meetings, about strategies. He was just here, in this moment, with her. Rachel finally broke the silence. You don't know anything about my life. Blake glanced at her. Then tell me. Rachel let out a soft laugh, shaking her head. It's not that interesting, Blake smirked. I disagree. Rachel looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time, there was something vulnerable in her expression. I grew up in a small town. My dad left when I was little. My mom worked herself to the bone to keep us afloat. I got pregnant with Chloe when I was 23. Her father wasn't interested in sticking around, so it's just been me and her ever since. Blake listened, the weight of her words settling deep in his chest. He had spent his life surrounded by people who had never known struggle, people who had always had a safety net, people who had never had to fight for survival the way Rachel had. She's lucky to have you, he said quietly. Rachel exhaled, a tired smile tugging at her lips. Some days, I wonder if I'm doing enough. Blake frowned. You are. Rachel looked at him, her eyes searching his, as if trying to decide whether to believe him. Then finally, she nodded. Thanks. Blake wanted to say more. He wanted to tell her that she was stronger than she realized, that she was more than enough, that Chloe was lucky to have a mother who loved her so fiercely. But before he could find the right words, Rachel stopped walking, turning to face him. This can't be real, she said, her voice quiet but firm. Whatever this is between us, it doesn't make sense. Blake felt something in his chest tighten. Why not? Rachel shook her head. Because guys like you don't end up with women like me. You live in a different world, Blake. One I don't belong in. Blake took a step closer, his gaze steady. What if I don't care about that? Rachel's lips parted slightly, her breath hitching. But then she looked away. I do. Blake clenched his jaw. He had never felt this kind of frustration before. Not the kind that came from losing a deal or missing an opportunity, but the kind that came from wanting something and not knowing how to reach it. Rachel, he started, but she shook her head. This was nice, she said, her voice softer now, almost apologetic. But it's not real, and I can't afford to get caught up in something that isn't real. Blake could see it in her eyes, the fear, the uncertainty. She had been let down too many times before, had built her life around the certainty that she could only rely on herself. And as much as he wanted to tell her that this was different, that he was different, he knew that words wouldn't be enough. So he let her walk away. He watched as she disappeared into the subway station, her figure swallowed by the crowd. And for the first time in his life, Blake Carter realized that he might have finally found something he couldn't win with charm or money or persistence alone. He had to earn it, and he had no idea how. Blake Carter had always believed that if he wanted something badly enough, he could find a way to make it his. That had been the foundation of his entire life, the rule he had lived by since he was young. He had built his empire with that mindset, conquered boardrooms, closed impossible deals, and made people bend to his will. But Rachel Evans wasn't a deal to be negotiated, or a challenge to be won. She was a woman who had spent her life protecting herself and her daughter from the kind of pain that men like him had probably inflicted before. And as much as he hated to admit it, he was starting to realize that he couldn't just charm his way into her life. He had to be something he had never been before. Patient. It had been 2 weeks since that night, since she had looked him in the eye and told him that whatever was happening between them wasn't real. And yet, Blake couldn't seem to shake the memory of it. He found himself thinking about her at the most unexpected moments, his mind drifting to the way she had smiled that night when she talked about Chloe, the way her voice had softened when she admitted that she sometimes questioned if she was doing enough. He had seen a different side of her then, a woman who carried the weight of the world on her shoulders but never once let it break her, and that had changed something in him. But Rachel had been right about one thing. He lived in a different world, one built on power, influence, and the unspoken rule that people like him didn't mix with people like her. Not because they weren't worthy, but because men like him had never been forced to fight for something real before. And maybe that was what scared him the most, that for the first time in his life, he was standing on unsteady ground, chasing something he couldn't control. Then came the phone call that changed everything. Blake had been in his office, staring blankly at a contract he was supposed to be reviewing when his phone buzzed. He almost ignored it, assuming it was just another business matter, another investor needing his attention. But then he saw the name flashing across the screen. Rachel. His heart did something strange, an unfamiliar tightening in his chest as he quickly answered. Rachel. There was silence on the other end, just the sound of her breathing, uneven and unsteady. Then, finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. I need your help. Blake was already on his feet, grabbing his keys before he even knew where he was going. Where are you? She gave him an address, one that wasn't her apartment or the restaurant, but somewhere unfamiliar. He didn't ask questions. He just got in his car and drove. When he arrived, he found her standing outside a small, run-down building, arms wrapped around herself, looking smaller than he had ever seen her. There was no fire in her eyes this time, no sharp-witted retort waiting on her lips. She looked afraid, and that sent a bolt of something dark and unfamiliar through him. He stepped out of the car, his voice steady but firm. What happened? Rachel exhaled shakily, glancing around as if making sure no one was watching. Liam's back. The name meant nothing to him at first, but the way she said it, the way her entire body tensed at just the mention of it, told him everything he needed to know. Chloe's father. Blake clenched his jaw, every instinct in him shifting. Did he hurt you? Rachel shook her head quickly. No, he showed up at Chloe's school today. He told the staff he was her father. He tried to talk to her. Blake's blood went cold. He had never met the man, but he knew men like him. The ones who left when things got difficult, who abandoned responsibility only to return when it was convenient for them. He had seen it in business, in the families of people he worked with. And now, Rachel was standing in front of him, looking like she was barely holding it together because someone who had already failed her once was threatening to do it again. What do you need me to do? Blake asked, his voice quiet but sure. Rachel hesitated, her eyes searching his, as if trying to decide whether she could really trust him with this. Then finally she said, I need him to stay away from her. Blake nodded once. Consider it done. Rachel exhaled, closing her eyes for a brief second. Blake, I don't want to drag you into this. You're not dragging me into anything, he said firmly. I told you, I'm not going anywhere. She looked at him then, and for the first time, he saw something in her eyes that hadn't been there before. Not just wariness, not just hesitation, but something dangerously close to hope. Blake knew that this wasn't just about protecting Chloe. It was about proving something to Rachel, proving that he could be the kind of man she needed, the kind of man who didn't walk away. And so, for the first time in his life, Blake Carter used his power for something other than business. Within hours, Liam Prescott had a restraining order against him, his name flagged in every system that mattered. If he so much as looked in Chloe's direction again, he would find himself in more legal trouble than he could ever dig himself out of. Rachel didn't ask how Blake did it, and he didn't tell her. She just nodded when he told her it was handled, her shoulders finally relaxing in a way that made something inside him tighten. Then, in a moment he hadn't expected, she reached for his hand. It was small, barely there, just the slightest brush of her fingers against his. But it was enough. Enough to tell him that maybe, just maybe, she was starting to believe in him. Blake squeezed her hand gently, his voice quiet, but firm. I won't let anything happen to her. Rachel swallowed hard, nodding. I know. And for the first time since this all began, Blake Carter realized that this wasn't about a bet anymore. It never had been. It was about her, about Chloe, about the kind of life he had never imagined for himself, but one he was starting to want more than anything. He just didn't know if Rachel would ever let him have it. Blake Carter had always believed that power could solve anything. A well-placed threat, a signature on a legal document, the sheer weight of his name. These were the tools he had used to build his empire, to shape the world into whatever he wanted it to be. But standing in Rachel Evans's small apartment, watching her hold Chloe close while the reality of their situation settled around them, he realized that some things couldn't be fixed with power alone. Some things required something he had never been taught to give: patience, trust, and the willingness to fight for something other than himself. Rachel had barely spoken since he told her that Liam wouldn't be a problem anymore. She had nodded, whispered a quiet "thank you," and then turned her attention back to Chloe, running her fingers through the little girl's hair in a way that made Blake feel like an outsider in a world he didn't belong to. He had never cared about that before. He had spent his life existing above the mess of real human emotions, above the complications of family and love and responsibility. But now, as he stood in the doorway, watching them, he felt something sharp and unfamiliar twist inside him. He wanted to be part of this. He didn't know when that had happened, didn't know when Rachel had stopped being a challenge and started becoming something more. But now that he had seen it, now that he had felt it, he wasn't sure he could walk away. Rachel finally looked up at him, her eyes heavy with exhaustion, but softer than he expected. You didn't have to do this, she said quietly. Blake met her gaze without hesitation. Yes, I did. Rachel exhaled, shaking her head. I don't want you thinking that I expect anything from you. I don't. Blake took a slow step forward. What if I want you to? Rachel's breath hitched slightly, but she masked it, quickly, retreating into the careful distance she always kept between them. Blake, this isn't your life. You don't have to be here. Blake clenched his jaw. What if I want to be? Silence stretched between them, heavy and unspoken. Rachel studied him like she was trying to find the cracks, the hidden agenda, the part where he would prove her right and walk away. But Blake wasn't walking away. Not this time. Chloe stirred in Rachel's arms, mumbling something before blinking up at him sleepily. Blake? Blake forced himself to smile, kneeling down so they were at eye level. Hey, kid. Chloe rubbed her eyes. You're still here. Blake nodded. I am. Chloe looked at him for a long moment, as if deciding whether that was a good thing or not, before finally offering him a small, sleepy smile. Okay. And just like that, she closed her eyes again, curling into her mother's chest, completely trusting that the world around her would be safe. Blake swallowed against the lump in his throat. He wasn't used to trust being given so freely. He had spent his life surrounded by people who expected something in return, people who played games with loyalty and power. But this was different. This was real. Rachel sighed, brushing a kiss against Chloe's forehead before carefully standing and motioning for Blake to follow her into the kitchen. He did, watching as she leaned against the counter, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. "What do you want from me, Blake?" Blake exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know." Rachel arched an eyebrow. "That's not an answer." Blake let out a dry chuckle. "You're right. It's not. But it's the truth." Rachel looked away, something in her expression shifting. "I don't do this. I don't let people in." Blake stepped closer, his voice softer now. "I know." Rachel clenched her jaw, shaking her head. "And I definitely don't fall for men like you." Blake hesitated, searching her face. "But you want to." Rachel inhaled sharply, her fingers tightening around the edge of the counter. "That's not fair." Blake sighed, closing the distance between them just enough to feel the tension between them crackling like electricity. "None of this is fair, Rachel. I wasn't supposed to feel this way. You weren't supposed to matter this much." Rachel's eyes searched his, looking for the lie, the manipulation, the part where he was still playing a game. But there was nothing there, just him, just the truth. Rachel exhaled shakily, her resolve wavering. "I don't know how to do this." Blake reached for her hand, gently, carefully, as if he was afraid she might disappear if he moved too fast. "Then let's figure it out together." Rachel looked down at their hands, at the way his fingers curled around hers like a silent promise, before finally meeting his gaze again. "You scare me." Blake's chest tightened. "You scare me too." Rachel let out a soft, almost bitter laugh. "That's not how this is supposed to work." Blake smiled slightly. "Then maybe we should stop worrying about how it's supposed to work and just let it happen." Rachel stared at him for a long time, weighing his words, weighing whatever it was that had been growing between them since the day he walked into that restaurant and refused to leave. And then, finally, she nodded. "Okay." Blake exhaled, relief washing over him in a way he hadn't expected. He hadn't won, not yet. But this was a start. And for the first time in his life, winning didn't seem to matter as much as simply being the kind of man Rachel could believe in. Blake Carter had spent his life mastering the art of control. Every decision he made, every step he took, was precise, intentional, leading him toward the life he had built for himself, one of power, wealth, and undeniable success. But standing in Rachel Evans's kitchen, watching the way she hesitated before letting him in, he felt something slipping through his fingers. This wasn't a deal to be closed, a contract to be signed. This was something far more fragile, something that couldn't be won with charm or money. And for the first time, he wasn't sure if he knew how to hold on to it. Rachel had agreed to let him in, but he could see the war she was fighting within herself. She wasn't the kind of woman who let people get close easily. Life had taught her not to. Every moment she had spent raising Chloe alone, every time she had been left to figure things out by herself, had built walls that no one had been able to break through. Until now. Until him. But just because she was letting him in, didn't mean she wasn't afraid, and Blake understood that fear better than he wanted to admit. Days passed, and something between them started to shift. It wasn't dramatic or immediate, but it was there, woven into the smallest of moments. The way Rachel started meeting his gaze a little longer before looking away. The way she let herself smile at his jokes without immediately trying to hide it. The way Chloe lit up every time she saw him, running toward him with an ease that made something ache deep in his chest. He wasn't used to this kind of life, to coming home to something that wasn't just an empty penthouse and an inbox full of emails. And yet, Every time he found himself at Rachel's apartment, it felt less like he was visiting and more like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. But no matter how much progress they made, Rachel never let herself fully relax around him. There was always a part of her that stayed guarded, always a part of her that refused to believe this could last. And Blake couldn't blame her. Because even though he had told himself this was real now, even though he had started to believe that Rachel and Chloe were becoming a part of his life in a way he had never planned, there was still something he hadn't told her. The truth about how this had all started. The truth about the bet. He had wanted to tell her. There had been moments when the words had been right there, sitting on the edge of his tongue. But every time he looked at her, every time she let herself get just a little closer to trusting him, he swallowed them back down. Because he knew that the second he told her, everything they had built would crumble. And he wasn't ready to lose her. Then one night, the decision was taken out of his hands. Rachel had just put Chloe to bed, and they were sitting on the couch, the quiet hum of the television filling the space between them. She looked comfortable, more at ease than he had ever seen her, and Blake found himself wanting to freeze the moment, to keep it from slipping away. Then his phone buzzed. He almost ignored it, but something in him told him to check. And when he did, his stomach dropped. "Nick, hope you're enjoying your little love story. Wonder what she'll think when she finds out how it started." Blake's entire body went cold. His grip on the phone tightened as he stared at the words, his heart hammering in his chest. He could feel Rachel's gaze on him, could feel the shift in the air as she picked up on the sudden tension in his body. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice laced with concern. Blake hesitated for only a second too long. Rachel's expression changed. She had spent years reading people, years learning to pick up on the smallest signs of dishonesty. And in that moment, Blake knew that she could see right through him. "Blake." Her voice was quieter now, but sharper. "What's going on?" He could have lied. He could have found some excuse, some way to push it aside. But the look in her eyes told him that she already knew there was something he wasn't telling her. So, he took a breath and said the words that would destroy everything. "There's something I need to tell you." Rachel didn't move, didn't blink. She just waited. Blake ran a hand through his hair, exhaling slowly. "I didn't come into that restaurant by accident. I was dared to. It was a bet." Silence. The kind that sucked all the air out of the room, that made everything feel unbearably heavy. Rachel's expression didn't change at first. She just stared at him, her body unnaturally still, like she was trying to process what he had just said. Then finally, she spoke. "A bet." Her voice was barely above a whisper. Blake swallowed hard. "Rachel, it wasn't supposed to be real. At first it was just a game?" Her voice was louder now, trembling with something Blake had never heard from her before. Not just anger, not just betrayal, but something that sounded terrifyingly close to heartbreak. Blake reached for her, but she jerked away so fast it felt like a slap. "Don't," she snapped, her breath coming faster now. "Don't touch me. Don't." "Try to explain." Blake clenched his fists, hating himself, hating that he had let it get this far without telling her the truth. "Rachel, please. It stopped being a bet a long time ago." Rachel let out a hollow laugh, shaking her head. "But it started that way, didn't it?" Blake didn't answer. He didn't need to. The silence was enough. Rachel stood abruptly, her hands shaking as she pushed past him. "I was right about you." Her voice was quieter now, but no less cutting. "I knew it was too good to be true." Blake stood too, his heart pounding. "Rachel, I love you." She froze, just for a second. Then she turned to look at him, and the devastation in her eyes nearly brought him to his knees. "You don't love me, Blake. You love winning." Blake felt like the air had been knocked out of his lungs. He wanted to argue, to tell her that she was wrong, that this had become something real, something that had nothing to do with the bet. but he could see it in her eyes. She didn't believe him, and maybe after everything she had no reason to. Rachel let out a shaky breath, straightening her shoulders. "I want you out." Blake felt something inside him fracture. "Rachel, don't do this." Rachel's jaw clenched, and when she spoke again her voice was cold. "Final. You already did." Blake stood there, watching as she turned and walked away, taking his heart with her. Blake Carter had never known what it was like to feel powerless. His entire life had been built on control, on knowing exactly what to say and do to get what he wanted. He had spent years perfecting the art of persuasion, turning even the most impossible situations in his favor. But as he stood outside Rachel Evans' apartment, listening to the sound of her locking the door behind him, he realized that there was nothing he could say, nothing he could do to fix this. She had looked at him with so much pain in her eyes, with so much betrayal, and he had never hated himself more than he did in that moment. The night air was cold, but it wasn't what made him shiver. It was the emptiness settling inside of him, the undeniable weight of knowing he had destroyed something real. He hadn't just lost a bet. He had lost her. And the worst part was that he had seen it coming. He had known that this moment would come, that the truth would eventually unravel. Everything! But instead of facing it head-on, instead of telling her himself, he had let it fester, had let himself believe that if he just held on to her long enough, she would never have to know. That had been his biggest mistake. Because Rachel wasn't the kind of woman who could live with a lie. And now, because of him, she would never believe that any of it had been real. He didn't know how long he stood there, staring at the door she had just closed on him. It felt final, absolute, like a chapter of his life had just been slammed shut. And yet, he couldn't bring himself to leave, because walking away meant accepting that he had broken something that could never be repaired. Walking away meant accepting that he had finally lost. Days passed, and Rachel didn't answer his calls, didn't respond to his messages. He tried everything, apologies, explanations, even silence, hoping she would reach out first, but she didn't. She had meant it when she told him to leave. She was done with him, and there was nothing he could do to change that. The realization settled inside him like a slow-burning ache, something that refused to fade no matter how much he tried to ignore it. He threw himself into work, into meetings and negotiations, but nothing felt the same. The boardroom, the deals, the constant chase for the next big success, none of it filled the void she had left behind. He found himself driving past the restaurant more than once, parking across the street just to catch a glimpse of her through the window. She looked the same, moving through her shift with the same quiet efficiency, the same resilience that had drawn him to her in the first place. But when she smiled at customers, it never quite reached her eyes. And Blake wondered if she was just as broken as he was. Then, one afternoon, he saw her leaving the restaurant with Chloe, walking down the sidewalk with her daughter's small hand tucked safely in hers. They looked like they belonged in a different world, one that had nothing to do with him, nothing to do with the life he had tried to build. And for the first time, he questioned whether he had ever deserved to be part of it in the first place. He couldn't keep doing this. Couldn't keep waiting for her to forgive him when he knew he hadn't given her a reason to. He had to prove it. He had to show her that what they had meant something, that it had never been just a game to him. But he also knew that words weren't enough, not this time. So he made a decision, a real one. The kind that wasn't about winning or proving a point, but about letting go of everything that had once defined him. He sold his company. He walked away from the empire he had spent years building, from the power and the prestige that had once mattered more than anything. It wasn't a grand gesture meant to impress her. It wasn't about making some dramatic sacrifice. It was simply what he needed to do. Because for the first time in his life, he wanted to build something that wasn't about money or control. He wanted to build something real. It was weeks before he saw her again. He had given her space, had waited until he had something worth saying. And when he finally showed up at her door, he felt something he had never felt before. Fear. Not fear of rejection, not fear of failure, but fear of losing the only thing that had ever truly mattered. Rachel opened the door slowly, her expression unreadable. She looked at him the way she had that night, like she was bracing herself for another lie, another disappointment. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice quieter than he remembered. Blake exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "I needed to see you." Rachel shook her head, her fingers tightening around the door. "Blake, I can't." "I sold the company," he interrupted. The words hung between them, heavy with meaning. Rachel blinked, her brows furrowing. "What?" "I walked away," Blake said, his voice steady. "From all of it. The company, the money, the life I thought I wanted. None of it mattered after I lost you." Rachel stared at him, her breath catching. "Why would you do that?" Blake took a step closer, his eyes never leaving hers. "Because I wanted to prove to you that this was never about a bet, that you and Chloe were never just part of some game to me. I was an idiot for not telling you the truth sooner, for thinking I could keep you without being honest about how it started. But I need you to know that how it started isn't what matters. What matters is what you became to me, what you still are to me." Rachel swallowed hard, her walls visibly cracking, but she wasn't ready to let them fall completely. "And what exactly am I to you, Blake?" Blake reached for her hand, gently, carefully, giving her the choice to pull away. "Everything." Rachel closed her eyes for a moment, and when she opened them, he saw the war in them, the battle between the love she still felt and the fear of trusting him again. "I don't know if I can forgive you," she whispered. Blake nodded. "I don't expect you to. Not yet. But I'm not going anywhere. I'll wait as long as it takes." Rachel let out a shaky breath, staring at him like she was trying to decide whether to believe him. And then slowly, cautiously, she stepped aside, opening the door just enough for him to come in. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't a promise. But it was a start. And for Blake Carter, that was enough. Love, trust, and redemption. 3 forces that define the journey of Blake and Rachel. This story is not just about a billionaire and a waitress. It is about transformation, about learning that true love is never a game, and that trust is fragile, but worth fighting for. Blake's story teaches us that wealth and power mean nothing without integrity, that winning in life isn't about success, but about who stands beside you in the end. Rachel's strength reminds us that self-worth is non-negotiable, that love, without honesty, is an illusion, and that sometimes walking away is the strongest choice of all. In the end, love isn't about grand gestures or wealth. It's about showing up, about proving with actions, not words. If this story moved you, if you believe in second chances and real love, support the channel by subscribing. Your support fuels more stories that touch the heart and inspire the soul.